Dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack and flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yup, what's good, original crew, man? We're back. Hey, we're back on the channel, man. We got Ballin' back in the building, man. We got Party Boy made his final calls at 3 a.m. Wonder what's this about. Hey, make sure y'all check out the links in the description box.
Down below.
You already know where to go. If you want to first support, all you gotta do is check out down below. Also, if you enjoyed today's video,
like it in with a thumbs up.
Also, shout out to the comment of the day.
Shout out to you.
We appreciate it, baby. Let's go. Let's check it out. Let's see what it's about.
One day in 2004, a young man was watching the news when a story about this savage murder case came on the TV. And at first, the young man really wasn't paying that much attention. But then a picture of the victim in this murder case flashed across the screen. And at first, the young man just stood there frozen in shock. But then he got up, ran to his computer, and began frantically searching through the chat logs of this old conversation he had had. And after a few minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for, he printed it out, and he called the police. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please go over to the like button's house and proceed to eat all the food in their fridge, but make sure you put back all the empty containers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of June 3rd, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri. His friends were already there. They were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, and as soon as they saw him, they waved him over. And so Jesse made his way over to sit with them. Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri, and he was majoring in journalism and pre-law. The spring semester had just ended a few weeks ago, and as much as Jesse had loved the semester and he really had enjoyed what he was studying, he was looking forward to some time off. He wanted to see his friends and go to some good parties. Jesse had always been a very outgoing person with a very active social life, but sometimes that characteristic sort of got him in trouble. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, he'd had to go to court over a charge of obstructing a government operation, which he'd picked up 2 months earlier when he refused to leave a house party that the cops were breaking up. And as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him, like, hey, how'd that court hearing go? And Jesse had said, it didn't go too well. He thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, and he had hoped the charge would have been dropped already. But when he had gone to the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was worse. But Jesse said, he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing to the very end, even if it took all summer. However, the reality was this charge was actually the least of Jesse's problems. He had much bigger things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently, and he was having a very hard time coping with that. Jack had wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though, the intention was good, it just made things harder for Jesse, because it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending quite a bit of time together and still talking and socializing. And while Jack felt like things were over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way. It just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even though they weren't. And then whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about, maybe trying to make things work again, Jack would immediately just turn him down. And so the whole situation was just really difficult. And so without Jack anymore, Jesse had become very lonely. And he had been trying to fill that void with random hookups, meeting guys online and inviting them to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk, but for the most part, it was sort of shallow and didn't mean anything. At one point, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting, but deep down, what Jesse really wanted was just a real relationship, like he had had with Jack. And these random hookups were not that. And so at this point, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing, he was always kind of on the hunt for somebody who could potentially have, long-term relationship potential. And this night was no exception. And so that night, Jesse and his friends had a nice dinner together. And then when they were done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks to a gay dance club called SoCo Club. It was dark and the music was loud and thumping. And as soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor over to the DJ booth. He asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And the DJ just sort of rolled their eyes. Jesse knew the DJ was very likely annoyed with him because Jesse requested that song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse never had let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. And so he didn't care. He just wanted the song played. And so after he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he waited, he saw a young man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse went over and asked the man if he wanted to dance. The man smiled and said, "Sure." And then one dance turned into two, turned into three, and pretty soon the two had spent the whole night together. Now, it was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate connection. And so when the club closed, Jesse asked if Ed wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes, and after that, Jesse asked his friend Jennifer if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to Jesse's apartment. She said of course, and so shortly after that, the trio left the club, they got in Jennifer's car, and they drove back to Jesse's apartment. And when Jesse and Ed got out, Jennifer said, "Hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by." And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, "Yeah, hopefully we'll both be there." And then Jennifer drove off. After Jennifer had driven off, Jesse walked Ed down the stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed saw this sea of all these history books stacked all over the living room. It would turn out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, opening up all these old history books. And as Ed did, Jesse began regaling him with, tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, how the Spartans were outnumbered and how they prevailed, and talking about Zeus and the ancient Greek gods, and just kind of going off all the stuff that Jesse really enjoyed about, ancient Greek history. And Ed, as he listened to it, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. And so from there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would spend the night together. And then at 10 a.m. the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper and then walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then once he was gone, Jesse just hoped that, maybe this wasn't just a meaningless hookup. Maybe this had the basis of a strong, long-term relationship. The one thing Jesse really wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was eating a quick lunch before heading out for work when he heard a knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, "Hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid rent." Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind, and he promised he would get it to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and, Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Because the truth was, he didn't have the money. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his whole family to go to college, and he had paid his bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left and tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who can do anything and go anywhere. And so even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find, but it still wasn't enough to make rent. He dropped the cash in the landlord's mailbox anyway, with a note promising he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent an uneventful evening behind the front desk, counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the end of his shift came, when the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted home and immediately changed clothes before heading out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he didn't see Ed. He did a lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and began chatting with Jennifer while he waited. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really late or he just was not coming. So, trying to tell himself that it was not quite time to be disappointed, maybe there was an explanation here, Jesse went outside and called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone. And so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened and it rang for a few beats. And then somebody picked up and it was a guy, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler. And, Jesse had never heard of this guy. And he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate and that actually Ed was asleep right now. He had to work in the morning. And so he had decided actually not to go to the party, to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of okay, is Mark like Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together or are they just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to Jesse right now. It was pretty clear in his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone. But Jesse was not ready to just, mail it in here. He wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, well, hold on a minute. Can you please go wake him up? I need to talk to him. And at first, Mark was like, no, he's asleep. He has work in the morning. He does not want me waking him up. But Jesse was relentless and just begged Mark to please, just for a second, put him on the phone. And eventually, Mark relented. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone, and as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited, and he basically pitched Ed hard on why he should not go to bed and come out to this party, and that he really wanted to see him. And also, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark. When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m. And then at that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party across the street. At around 3 a.m. though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, he had to get up in the morning, he had to go. And so at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk and then asked him if, hey, do you want to come over to my place? But Ed said, no, really, I have to get home. I have to go to bed. However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer. And then after that, he began making the walk to his own apartment. And as he was making this short walk to his own place, he began to think that he didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. And so Jesse called Jack a few times, and when Jack did not pick up, after all, it's 3 a.m, and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't, but at that point, Jesse still wanted to see him, and so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment. Jesse went right up to the door and banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, Jesse began to wonder if, well, maybe Jack's out with somebody else right now, and he suddenly felt so jealous. Or worse, maybe Jack is here and he knows I'm here, but he doesn't want to see me and he's ignoring me. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from Jack, Jesse finally gave up and stumbled back to his own apartment, drunk and lonely, and a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he'd gotten undressed and flopped down on his bed, he heard a knock at the front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, so Saturday, June 5th, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building, and they were carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled into the parking lot, and they were about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he assumed, this was just somebody passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia Police Detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping crowds of worried neighbors away from this crime scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. It was a young man sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts with no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And across his throat was this very deep gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body, and she told Detective Short that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, their arms, and their torso. But when she lifted the victim's hands, there were no defensive wounds on them. She told Short that that was pretty unusual for a knife attack, where the victims usually got their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they got their hands cut up. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and pooled under his body. But there was no blood at all on the front of his body, which meant he was probably lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Short the hemorrhaging in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so putting it all together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out and then laid him on the grass and then slit his throat while he was laying there unconscious, unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt, like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began on the lawn where the body was found, and now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here, and that this was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he'd been running from. And so Short stood up and stepped away from the body so crime scene techs could load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up and two more officers got out, Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this neighborhood. So another sergeant on scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. And Rios came over and he looked inside, and after a second, he said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he'd actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good guesses about how his victim was killed. His next task was figuring out who might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead.
Right.
So, Short looked up Jesse's address, and he found his apartment building was only a block away. So, he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, an officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared.
Is that a duplex? Like one door right here, one door right here?
Could be.
Or is it one of those multi-family homes where you probably also got people on this side too? Reason why I'm asking, because wondering if any neighbors heard anything.
Yeah.
Because typically in like duplexes and like the walls are thin, and then you hear what's going on, and so if it is a loud commotion going on,
Inside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they'd arrived, the door was actually already open. And so Short went inside the actual unit and began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned, so there was no clear sign of a struggle. But the door being left open suggested that Jesse must have left in a hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and his killer starting in one location and ending on the lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer likely was pretty strong and pretty fast. So we're talking about somebody who is in relatively good shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he's developed in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed kind of personal, which suggested that whoever killed Jesse likely was somebody Jesse actually knew. And so with that in mind, Short finished his sweep of Jesse's apartment and then asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and computer that he saw on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder and wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this. But then it was like this look of realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night, he had actually woken up to the sound of very clearly two grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was clearly Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No," and "Stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly said, they didn't actually do anything about this. They actually just kind of banged on their own wall and said, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped and the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and gone to sleep.
They said Jesse didn't have any bruises on him, right? Because that's the biggest thing. Like, I'm saying on his hand, not on him. He had bruises on his body, like from, I guess,
But he
punches.
didn't have any defensive wounds or anything.
What about his knuckles? Bruising of the knuckles, potentially from fighting?
I would say not. To say said there was like no type of.
So, because that screams out a lot to me. And for him to only have on shorts with no socks, shoes, no shirt, vulnerability. Also, it has to be somebody. Never mind, because I'm saying for the fight back part.
Because you're taking what the neighbor's saying, that he heard fighting and stuff, right?
No, I'm just talking about the markings on the body too, because I'm like, typically anybody, if it's a stranger, it's no stranger because you would have had the defensive wound. Also, you would have had bruising to the knuckles if it was a stranger or if it was random. You get what I mean? You get what I'm headed at? It had to be somebody he personally had a personal connection with. For you possibly not to fight back, but they also caught you off guard because you also vulnerable, so you had no socks, no shoes on, so it did catch you off by surprise, and then because you had to flee the house with just that on.
Yeah.
After that, the noise had stopped, and the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and gone to sleep, not realizing what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when they had woken up that afternoon, he'd actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was open, and he didn't look inside. He felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the opened door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door, and so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about their business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all, so he did not know who this other person was. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information, then he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin in Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment late at night like that.
Right.
Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it spurned a fight? Like, he didn't know, but who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, One of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone and he was holding it in the air like he had found something. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs, and the tech told Short that there was something in there that he definitely wanted to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Barry 7 times between 3 and 3:18 that morning.
And another thing I'm thinking will be hard to narrow down as well is the fact that Jesse did hook up with so many random people, which will make it even harder to like determine.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't limit the search.
Yeah.
It broadens this, you know?
Facts.
So right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Barry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's, and so he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered, and he had very red, puffy eyes like he'd clearly been crying. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see the detective. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news a friend had told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend and Jesse had kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jack. Jack said the night before, he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again, and before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door. And he saw it was the middle of the night, and then he leaned over and saw the caller was Jesse, and he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me, it's very likely him at the front door, I don't want to see him right now, and so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope he went away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind. Like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying, at the time, Jesse was killed, I was home alone by myself, which was pretty weak. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in the alibi, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon, and during that phone call, Jesse had told him about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before. And his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here, but there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster, because Columbia was a college town where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and, staff of the university really wanted Short to get this thing done. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. After all, Ed was shaking and fidgety looking. He seemed sort of like an emotional wreck. Which could mean, of course, he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's traumatic. Or it could mean he's hiding something, and now he's about to be interrogated by the police, something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to his apartment at 3 a.m., and Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story and asked a few follow-up questions, and then also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this, search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure and looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who'd seen Jesse that night, and obviously Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out the gate that he did not like Jesse, and actually he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said, but Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own, and he actually didn't know what time he got back. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed.
Right.
Which also throws Ed alibi off, because Ed said Mark was at the house when he got there. And he just went in and went to sleep.
Right. So when he went to sleep, he was there, but you saying it's throwing Ed's off.
Yeah, because Ed said he left the party. He went on a date. And he doesn't know what time he got back. So if at 3 o'clock, Ed said he arrived.
Yeah.
Then if was Mark there or not, then he could put himself there at around 3 a.m. too. You got your eye on somebody?
I'm just listening.
Yeah, she does.
And so obviously something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample and added Mark to the suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they'd all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia.
True.
Jesse apparently had been hounding his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want. And the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things got out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup. And some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that, somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while searching Ed's house, they'd found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past and openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he died. But they'd only met one time, and very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. Like, to what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like something was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner and told him a tip had just come in. And it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps, even amongst the investigators.
Ooh.
The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department.
Whoa. And because Jesse been trying to get some money out of him because he was behind on his rent. Because typically when people be wherever mess with older people, they wanting a little bit of money. You know what I'm saying?
I forgot he mentioned that in the beginning with the...
Yeah.
And kind of like,
it
was like he said it and I was like, oh, okay, yeah.
But he also mentioned Jesse was fooling around with a lot more people too, though, on these different online and stuff.
Yeah.
But he did mention that one.
Later that day, so this is Sunday, June 6th, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they clearly were carrying on this totally illicit affair while on duty. That's not okay. And also they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then also on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very carefully here.
Yep.
Because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every officer he passed. And he realized there wasn't a single person here he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat at his desk, and pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had told them about this cop he was sleeping with. And one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it, and he discovered out of the 200 plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the name Anderson. Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. And so the next step was trying to figure out if either of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at the house party back in April. And as he flipped through it, he realized Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found the killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him and showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest. And Brad nodded and said, yeah. He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence, but just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he was like, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about, Jesse being his gay lover. But Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal, because even though, again, it was terrible in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there's truth there. Maybe Rios knows that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not, aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all three of them just kind of went their separate ways, and Short, hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she let in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. And he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then after they were done, the cop told Andy, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. I mean, the final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook and told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall."
Damn.
Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of June 5th, 2004.
Wow.
Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after work. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no strings attached, late night secret hookup. But when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse told the killer that he had figured out they were married. And so now he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see him anymore. But when he told the killer to leave and the killer refused, Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. So in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped an arm around his neck and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then the killer laid Jesse out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. And then, on the way home, the killer very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring nobody would ever find it, because they knew the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to the front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag on their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name. And in fact, he actually stole the name tag, not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson, Ted Anderson. He was using his name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse. Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he got a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison.
Well, what's the stipulation, though? We know about that. Well, he got it. How many years he got to do?
Go back so I can read I was trying to see the article. The 12-person jury also sentenced Rios to 10 years in prison for armed criminal action. Oh, okay. I just seen 10 years something, and I was trying to see what that was.
I'm sure you can probably look it up.
Yeah, most definitely.
Matter of fact, what's his name?
Stephen Rios.
Let me see. I'm sure. Let me see.
Legal evidence.
I don't say. I reference some stuff, but I don't.
Wow. Cause you know something, when he kept, I was like, in my head, honestly, I was thinking, I said 9 times out of 10, I was like, it's someone young, right?
Remember, he said in shape. Rios is in shape.
And then even like, what he kept calling them, was it Missouri or Columbia's finest?
Columbia Finance.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, I'm like, it gotta be somebody young. So, but when they show Brad Anderson, I'm like, he an older guy. Yeah. I was like, Ted, he older too, but I'm like, I'm thinking it has to be somebody younger.
And how you the first one on the first ones on the
you
scene?
know what I'm saying? You identifying them. I'm like
that's
everything.
crazy.
Like I get he was just arrested at a party, so yeah, you were,
But no, that's still crazy.
I'm just like, you just. And then you making these comments. For you to even make a comment like that, you trying to get eyes off of you. Yep. You know what I'm saying? Because who would say something like that? Yep. Like knowing that this, like the investigators investigate, this is a cop, this is your colleague. Why would you say something like that? That's kind of weird. And you would say it for him to hear. And everyone like, oh, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Because he was really trying to push the eyes on Brad.
On Brad, yeah.
Because he knew the last night. Because he knew he'd been wearing the badge.
Yeah, so if something did come back, they gonna think that it was one of these Andersons, Brad or Ted, because that's what you know me by. That's the name tag I've been wearing. Even with Andy joining them, with him joining Andy and Jesse. Mm-hmm. I just know him by. I know his face.
Remember, also Jesse was arrested.
Mm-hmm.
He probably know there was an Anderson that arrested me that night, and he probably thought he was Anderson. He probably didn't get the names of all the officers, like direct names. He probably just know, hey, you're Anderson that arrested me that night. So even if Jesse went back to the police, said, Anderson that arrested me that night, I've been messing with. Mm-hmm. They would have went to Brad. They would have never realized it was Rios.
Yeah. They would have went to Brad or Ted, but still.
I'm saying arresting him that night.
Oh, that night who arresting officers.
Yeah, because Stephen and Brad was a part of the arresting.
That's right.
But the thing is, Stephen knew. Mm-hmm. Stephen was trying to track it. Man. But reason why he snapped and killed him, because he threatened that he was going to tell on him. And he was like, okay, you ain't going to keep a secret. I got to get rid of you.
Yeah, because
everything was going to blow up.
You got a wife, you got a new baby.
Yeah. And I was going to lose my job.
Because
how many times we've seen body cams already of people who have went back after the fact of arresting people and tried to have a situation of whatever, and that's against company policy or whatever policy. They can't interact with you. If they have arrested you, they can lose their job in a bad strip for interacting with anyone that they have arrested before. It's a conflict of interest, which also his case can get thrown out.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's so sad.
And you did. Because honestly, and that's what I said earlier, I said it had to be somebody he knew already.
Facts.
Somebody he had somewhat feelings towards.
And let me say this real quick. True. And also with Brad, I don't know how Brad...
He had all these bruising on his... My bad.
I don't know how Brad probably... the picture they kept showing, I don't know if that, you know...
Brad didn't look like... He looked older.
I'm thinking
also,
I'm like, you running someone down?
But like, also, they are cops. Some cops are faster than
some cops are faster than others.
I'm saying faster than what you think.
Yeah. But the entire time in my head, I'm just thinking, like, it has to be somebody young. So when he brought up Brad, I was like, okay, well, I guess you got your guy.
I ain't gonna hold you.
But
I ain't gonna hold you.
Like,
my stepdad, former police officer, still was in the military.
Yeah.
I ran with the bro. Not when I was this size, y'all. Not at all. This is back in high school. I was on a baseball team and shit, whatever.
Yeah.
Motherfucker was fast. I said, ain't no
way.
I
know some older people that are fast. I'm not saying nothing
no,
about
I'm
that.
saying I said, bro, I was like, nah. I said, I'm gonna be able to like outdo him.
Yeah.
I said, bro, he outdoing me, bro. What the hell? I said, no. And then I thought about it, I said, bro, he military trained and he former police, so that's what he do anyway. But
definitely what Columbia Finance or whatever, that really got me. I said,
oh, when he said that, I knew it was a police officer.
Like, we knew that already. But I'm saying, I just kept in my head, I was just like, it has to be a younger guy. That's just what I was thinking. But then when he said Brad or Ted, the two Andersons, I was like, well, dang. Then I guess what I was thinking is not, you know.
But it does make sense, though. And luckily, what was his name? Steven? Mm-hmm. Luckily, not him, the other guy.
Ted?
No, the one that came to the precinct and told
about Andy.
Was it Andy? Shout out to Andy for even remembering that. And being comfortable enough at that time. Because don't forget, this is 04. Mm-hmm. People want as out then as they are now.
Yeah.
Some people still didn't want people to know all their business.
Yeah.
But shout out to him to have that courage to even come and approach, to even relay that information. Because some people were like,
honestly,
you get what I mean?
Facts.
Because he probably would have thought like I know his secret, especially when he walked in the precinct. I wonder, did Rios even recognize him?
Did you recognize him, or did y'all make eye contact, or did you like walk past him and you just seen him in the hallway?
But Steven normally goes and hook up with
Jesse
when he's intoxicated late at night. So did you even recognize Andy that night you had the threesome?
Maybe not. I don't know.
He probably did like that just a hookup.
And also kudos to the friend in St. Louis too that even remembered these chats and even reached out because that's what really got it.
True.
You know.
But honestly, Andy probably would have still came up. Because,
he probably.
Because Andy didn't even know they were looking at.
No.
Or did he? Because the detective did call around to his friends. He did
call around to different people. But I don't know if he one of the ones or he just was like, wait a minute, I got a little information. This may help.
Because the case was solved pretty fast.
Yeah. So
because it happened on the 5th. No, it happened on the 4th. In between the night of the 4th and the 5th. Matter of fact, it happened on the 5th. Because his body was discovered on the 5th that same Saturday morning. So, Saturday around 2 p.m. So, it happened that early Saturday morning. Yeah. And it was actually solved pretty fast. That's some good detective work right there. Yeah. I know we normally talk shit about the detectives and stuff, but that's actually good detective work. Because, like, you had nothing because he hooked up with a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Jack made sense because you always look at the partner or the most recent partner
or whatever.
But that one didn't 100% make sense.
It didn't make sense. No.
Ed possibly.
Yeah, but also
Matt possibly. Those
Mark.
Mark.
But possibly. When Mark came in already, like I don't give
a fuck about it.
No. But I'm like, what would you unless you like had some type of like secret.
Unless him and Ed had been messing around. Mm-hmm. But when my bad, go finish.
That's all I'm about to say.
Unless him and Ed had been messing around, or he secretly had a
crush or something.
A crush on
like,
that.
Like secretly in love with him, but don't want to, whatever. I don't know. But normally sometimes that happens if the other person is not already like out, like, they're not like open about,
Yeah.
Then you be having like these secret, like, oh my gosh, I want to confess my love, but I don't know how they're going to take it or whatever. Or y'all just like friends and you don't want to mess up their friendship or something like that. But then when he came in was like, I said, okay, we still.
His demeanor, bro. I said,
I'm like, why you don't like him? You just met him. You don't even know him. But he
probably was like, he was nagging and everything, and I don't even.
Sometimes some people personality, because his personality seemed very like outgoing and bubbly and like not, and sometimes that rubs some people the wrong way.
Like the extrovert, he was a real extrovert. He probably was too extrovert. He was like, bro, I don't like this.
Yeah, but some people just don't know how to handle that. But
so when he came in and he immediately said that, I said a killer would never admit that they don't like.
Some of them would.
Yeah, that's some motherfucking crazy ass killers right there.
But most killers what would you have to gain? Like what? Like why? But then also when the neighbors like he heard someone arguing, I'm like. 9 times out of 10, it gotta be somebody you probably know, right?
Yeah.
If y'all to be having this heated argument or whatever the case, whatever the case is. And then I also was like, do Mark even know where he stays? I thought about that.
So in my head, I was like, maybe he trailed him.
But then Mark, it's kind of.
You could have trailed him. Pete, let's not. We seen one.
You don't even like me. What? Don't trail me home.
No, I'm saying from a far distance. Remember that one we seen?
I know from a far distance. I know.
Remember that one we seen the boy in Detroit? Remember he had met him at the gas station. Mm-hmm. He found out where they stayed. He walked back, like cut back over, killed them, and then ran back home. Mm. I was thinking about stuff like that in my head, which is a true situation. But I was like, Mark, nah. But also, like I kept reiterating the fact that. The bruising on the body. Yeah. He had already jumped on Jesse in the house. That's the reason why he had the bruising on the body. And he probably didn't fight back because he probably thought Rios would have been able to overpower him. Mm-hmm. And so the best thing he thought in his head was to run and get away as quick as possible because Rios is a police officer. Yeah. He probably think he's going to overpower me. He's stronger than me. The best thing I can do is run. That's the reason why he had the bruising on the body because Rios was already hitting him. And then when he ran, when he finally caught up to him, he strangled him. And he was like, I know, like, I ain't strangled him that long. I need to cut his throat. That's so crazy, sad, bro. That's sad. And your wife was still up waiting on you?
Fixing a baby
bottle, but still.
You got the nerve to be using somebody else's name. Like, the fact that you even going through, like, those great lengths to make sure that, like, you one living this double life, doing all this stuff, and there's no telling who else. Because for you to do something to even like, how long you been a
dirty cop
doing stuff like that? Yeah,
you'd probably arrested people that didn't need to be arrested. You probably gave people tickets,
or then arrested people and was like, hey, if you do this, I'll let you go. What? Who knows? That's but true. Rest in peace to Jesse, though.
Yeah,
that's so sad, bro.
But hey, man, y'all spend us up, man. That was a good twist, though. I was like,
I hate that though.
Cause he said Rios, in my head, I'm just like, that went. Yeah. Then when Rios popped back up and he was Anderson, I was like, Rios did it, bro.
But yeah.
Spam us up. Let us know y'all thoughts about it for us down below. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go by the name DJ No Kid. This is
Sierra Nicole.
We are.
Kid and C.
We are.
Time to kick it, got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar.